I had visited Ethiopia back, I think it was in the late 90s. And I just remember having spoken to someone, I can't remember if it was maybe a taxi driver, who was talking about the Eritrean-Ethiopian war and saying it was like two bald men fighting over a comb. Like what are the combs even here? Like it's unclear to me. What are their resources? I mean, I understand the idea of like I want power, and the Tigrayians are a challenge to my power, but over what? Are there reasons? Is this a resource fight, or is it just simply? I mean, I'm just unclear on what is driving the motivations for these, because it's, at one point these two are allied, the Eritreans and the Tigrayans are allied, and then the Amhara and the Eritreans are allied against I mean, it just keeps shuffling around. It's unclear to me are there any sort of like, I guess, sort of static realities about resources that are involved here?
Absolutely. I mean, there's static resources, whether it's farming, whether it's water resources, power, guns, loyalties with other nations around the world. I mean, as we know, and really my interest in Ethiopia goes back to the 1960s, when my father was there, an American soldier who was on a base, classified still today, outside of Asmara, Eritrea. And it was really American influence that kept Eritrea under the imperial power of Ethiopia until 1991. Eritrea had been colonized by the Italians. They had a lot of incredible infrastructure and kind of this Western-facing identity. Not to say that racism wasn't a huge part of the colonial experience. But when the Americans and others pushed for Ethiopia to maintain control of Eritrea, it was so the Americans could keep this base. And the Eritreans were incredibly resentful. Ethiopia at the time was quite feudal, and Haile Selassie was an emperor. And so the independence movement rose up there. The power struggle was for independence, to make their own decisions. I could have asked you the same question maybe about Florida or Montana. Like, these are places, this is home of a population, quite ancient history, very beautiful tradition, and who makes their decisions for them, for these populations, means very much to them. Eritrea is a dictatorship, one of the most authoritarian countries, like I said, and it's a strange place to be. I went back in 2019, right after peace was made between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And Eritrea is a strange place today, one of the highest refugee populations because of mandatory conscription. In Ethiopia, Abiy wants power. I mean, Ethiopia has a fantastic economy. If you're talking about the continent, it's been one of the most stable countries in the Horn. And as you know, it's surrounded by a whole lot of trouble. Somalia is there, and in the news recently. Eritrea is building a huge dam. I have a second piece about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and the trouble that it's created with Sudan and farther upriver Egypt. I'm sorry, downriver Egypt. The Nile, of course, flows from the south to the north. So this is a strategic region. As I mentioned, the United States had this base in Eritrea for quite a while, until the downfall of Haile Selassie in 1974. But, Ethiopians were great allies to the United States when they were working on, that hideous war on terror, fighting al-Shabaab, other ways that the United States has partnered. Nick Turse has done a lot of great reporting about how the NSA built a surveillance network in Ethiopia. So strategically and for other reasons, not just our own interests, but on the ground, there are interests that mean very much to individuals there. And one is, coming democracy.
Right. So let's talk about what you found in terms of the evidence of what appears to be both sides committing atrocities against civilians.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that the concentration of atrocities and atrocities, to list it, is these incredible mass killings, systematic rape, use of food as a weapon of war, use of medicine, lack of medicine as a weapon of war, use of social media, internet access. But yes, the concentration was in Tigray. We still don't know because Tigray is still blacked out for us. But when the TPLF left the borders of Tigray and started to move south, they moved very quickly. They were moving toward Addis Ababa, and I had a visa. I was waiting to go to Ethiopia, and the State Department was sending me probably 3 emails a day saying, do not go to Ethiopia because we will not be able to get you out.
Wow.
I know. Whoever thought that Addis would be threatened, and yet it was. And they got as far south as maybe 200 kilometers from Addis Ababa, and then were pushed back. Their supply lines were too thin, and they just didn't have the resources. And Lalibela was one of the cities. It's a city in the Amhara state, a very holy city. Churches carved out of solid rock. I don't know if you got there to see them when you were in Ethiopia. But Lalibela had been held by the TPLF for 5 months. And it seemed an interesting place to go to talk to people who could tell me what the war had been like. And so that's where I start at the beginning of the piece, where I'm in Lalibela, and I happen to come across a Fano training, again, this Amhara militia that has been allying with federal troops, Amhara security forces, and Eritrean troops, and are accused of some of the most horrifying atrocities in Tigray.
What is the involvement of parties outside of Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Tigray? I mean, has there been where are all the weapons coming from? And I mean, I assume a healthy amount coming from the United States. But where is the rest of the world in terms of this conflict?
It's hard to understand. Tigray has been quite secretive and also quite cut off. The Western Tigray territory is still in contention, and that's really Tigray's only route through Sudan. So they've had, Sudanese allies and others. They've also had Oromo allies. Oromo is the largest ethnic group in the country. And the federal forces, of course, Abiy's been getting weapons from anyone he can, whether it's Turkey or the UAE. Isaiah Afwerki is kind of a mystery. He's not one to give press releases on where he's getting his weapons, but he seems like he's got a good cache. He's been sitting on them for a while. So there are a number of countries in that area, particularly Middle East and other Horn nations, who have played allies, but they've played them rather loose in all of this. I think the hope is that Ethiopia remains strong, and it seems as though loyalty will go to the one who looks like he's the winner.
What would be the interests of outside groups? I guess just that Ethiopia maintains its strength, and that the U.S. still has its sort of resources there, I guess, or in terms of like a base, or just sort of, it's so unclear to me what the agendas are.
Well, I just read a piece this morning in Financial Times about the role that Russia is playing in seeking satellites there. So they're using Wagner Group and other resources to build loyalties across the Sahel. They're I forget what they're calling it. It was a kind of a fancy term, but Russia is working very hard. It's kind of like a post-colonial era where in my father's time, he was in the Horn of Africa trying to secure allies for the United States. It's kind of a proxy Cold War was building from the 1960s forward. And I think we're seeing a period of time as well where China is sinking tons of money into the continent, and Russia has its own power plays as well. And, neither of those nations asked for humanitarian governance when they offer financing or weapons or security forces, where the United States does. And it depends on what fight you want to discuss. Is it, spreading democracy, which is kind of a flaccid term at the moment? Like, of course, we don't want to see these kinds of atrocities taking place. Or is it influence? When you look at the UN vote on Ukraine and Russia, should Russia be sanctioned? Look at the number of African countries that were quiet and said that it shouldn't.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Lastly, how is it that they managed to have, like, how do you shut down the entire country and have so little information come out? I mean, it's just like, it just seems, is there, outside of the States, how have they been so successful in keeping this information sort of like so a bottlenecked?
Yeah, misinformation, disinformation, all of that has been incredibly helpful. The borders have been impassable. Aid groups have not been allowed in. Like I said, even today, last week, a bunch of journalists in Somali state of Ethiopia were incarcerated. So I think the government is really scary. They're unscrupuled and they're willing to silence anyone they can. And they, when you turn off the internet, when you turn off cell service, right, you've got refugees coming out, but they're still afraid. And also, this is a part of the world where punishment of families of those who speak out is not unheard of. And so, we use a few pseudonyms in my piece. I spoke to a Tigrayan in Addis Ababa, who had been detained and incarcerated along with his wife for a period of time. The federal government was doing that during a part of the war as well. And fear. And as you've seen, so much misinformation, disinformation on the internet.